This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
And thank you, Claudia and Peter, for the kind information. The invitation, the conference has already been immensely fruitful for me. In his 1929 Hertziana lecture, just before he glosses the 9 screens riddled with images that hung on the walls of the lecture hall, Aby Warburg reflects on his method. Quote, "Through a combination of pictorial elements with the products of language in prose or in poetry, it is possible to gain scale and perspective for every process that art history used to label with the buzzword Mannerist or Baroque degeneration, Entartung." The lecture, we know, traces how Ghirlandaio's imitation of classical images found, quote, a northern reception mirror in the art of Dürer, Rembrandt, and Rubens. Warburg's combinatorial method, then, would make tangible why these northern artists should not be branded Baroque. What, though, does he mean by Mannerist or Baroque degeneration? The lecture offers no definition of the Baroque, and Entartung, which the Nazis, with their mock exhibitions of entartete Kunst, would soon give such chilling connotations. Why does Warburg scorn the term? That the Baroque haunted Warburg in ways critical to his Kulturwissenschaft is a primary contention of my paper. With this said, Walter Benjamin's seminal study of the German Baroque, Ursprung des deutschen Trauerspiels, published the year before the Hertziana lecture, had no discernible affect or effect on Warburg. Sent to the KBW by Benjamin's publisher, the book was then sent to Saxel by Warburg. Warburg even inscribed it, not with his name, but with, as we just saw, with the KBW inscription, though there's no evidence he read any of it. As for Saxel, he thought the book was zu gescheit, which I guess you would translate into English, too clever by a half, while Panofsky found it zu klug, even while admitting that, quote, he learned a great deal from it. Part of what he learned was surely how boldly the scholarship of the Warburg Circle could be appropriated. For Panofsky and Saxel, following the lead of Warburg's 1920 essay, Pagan Antique Prognostication in Words and Images in Luther's Time, had made Dürer's Melancholia I a test case of their nascent iconology. In the prognostication essay and its offshoots, Dürer exemplifies the humanist possibility of mediating astrological abstraction and determinism with the inimitable persuasive force of self-expression. By contrast, Benjamin's allegoresis of the Dürer engraving as an avatar of a melancholic, exorbitant Baroque is based on, as Scholem explains in a letter recommending his friend's book to Saxel, quote, entirely different starting points, Ausgangspunkten. In any case, as you know, Benjamin's Baroque book, as he came to call it, did not gain him entrée to the Warburg Circle, and the rest, one might say, is counterfactual history. For my part, I want to figure ways in which Warburg's and Benjamin's Baroques converge and diverge in what Jane Newman cagily calls the heroic age of German scholarship on the Baroque. If Warburg in the late 1920s is still responding to Heinrich Wölflin's version of the Baroque, so is Benjamin, who is also answering more contemporary versions promoted by Fritz Strick, Werner Weissbach, and many others. Still, both remain outliers. Benjamin persists with his often hermetic Trauerspiel book, even after German academia scorns it, while Warburg characteristically offers an oblique, episodic critique. In the years after his discharge from Kreuzlingen, figures typically labeled Baroque, like Kepler, Ovid, Rembrandt, Rubens, and Bruno, captivate him, though he publishes nothing on them. And if Warburg's Baroque is largely visual and Benjamin's Baroque chiefly literary, a kind of complementarity as Professor Diaz reminds us, both consistently scorn disciplinary border guards. For both it may be said, Methode ist Umweg. To anticipate further, each variously treats the Baroque as a period concept and as a universal recursive stylistic phenomenon. But for Benjamin, such periodization is an idea, quote unquote, while for Warburg, it summons monstra needing to be tamed. More particularly, for Warburg, the Baroque occurs when pathos formulae are tied off or disconnected, when contemplative distance is distorted, and thus when hermeneutic spiritual equanimity is lost. In a 1927 notebook entry, he asserts, quote, essence of the Baroque style, manipulation with tied-off, abgeschnürten dynamograms. Like a tourniquet, Baroque style constricts the possibility of dynamic Nachleben. A metaphor about metaphor, abgeschnürt signals that style has become too abstract, obscure, and solipsistic. Crucially, it applies not just to art historical matters. In a 1927 Tagebuch entry, Warburg recounts, Saxel has rather hastily rejected my definition of astrology as the cult of monstrous metaphor. I should have perhaps added of the tied-off, abgeschnürten metaphor. Tied off from what? From the connection with the observed star. This anti-cosmological tying off annuls, therefore, the sphere as a purposeful instrument in the business of orientation. Through this, the biomorphic elements for the observing subject's busy metamorphosis are let loose. Also thereby lost is the guaranteed unambiguousness of metaphor as objective determination of scope through the necessary act of observation. The diatactic hermetic linkage appears instead of the Hellenic logical mathematical place-determined one. This Alexandrian element is hostile to Europe, forcing her to false conclusions. Cosmologic against cosmodiatactic. Metaphor as special deity, thanks to Usna. A tied-off metaphor forestalls the observer winning a viable objektive Umfangsbestimmung. Ignoring reason's pragmatic claims, the astrological imagination cultivates instead what the prognostication essay dubs Schlitterlogik, which I guess you would translate as skating or slippery logic. Further, diatactic, which means pertaining to order or arrangement, connotes excessive artifice and recalls Warburg's oft-expressed view that medieval imagery demotes the body's sensuous aspects, or what here he calls biomorphic elements. Alexandrian astrology is thus decried for ignoring the kind of Orientierung, a key Warburgian concept that astronomers like Ptolemy furnished. Since astrology gives the observer too much license to manipulate the cosmos, metaphor becomes what one of Warburg's teachers, the philologist and historian of religion Hermann Usna, terms a Sondergott, or a metaphor fueling murky myth, rather than producing clear concepts about real and symbolic relations between self and cosmos. Thus, Warburg suggests a formal but also cultural historical regress, from the universal back to the particular, from Hellenic science down to Hellenistic astrology and its recursive myths. Untethered to the phenomena themselves, the imagination runs wild, weaving excessive artifices, finding hermetic hieroglyphs where cosmologic once reigned. Put another way, when Alexandrian astrology and Baroque art manipulate disconnected dynamograms, this amounts to saying that the pathos formulae have become too allegorical. Meanwhile, borrowing again from philology, Warburg elsewhere equates the Baroque style with superlativa. The Baroque artist, he writes, seizes upon, quote, more intense expressions which he now introduces as comparative heightened forms. These degenerate to tied-off superlatives of gestural language whose usury of essential meaning is foremost an intoxicated one, end quote. This account of superlatives derives partly from Hermann Osthoff's research in comparative linguistics. Beginning indeed with the 1905 essay on Dürer, Warburg invokes Osthoff's 1899 study of how the irregular morphology of superlative and comparative adjectives reflects overcharged emotional content. Thus, just as language is deformed by excessive pathos, so are artistic forms. The brief contra the Baroque in Dürer and Italian antiquity starts with the premise that for late Quattrocento artists, Orpheus' death was a pathos formula, quote, a passionately and knowingly felt experience from the dark mystery play of Dionysian legend, end quote. But in this, Dürer trumps his Italian counterparts, for he uniquely balances such self-conscious erlebnis with a mastery of objective form to narrow the gap, achieve a vital historical translatio between antiquity and his own time. The more sober Dürer thus rejects the überlebendige Muskelrhetorik, the lively rhetoric of muscles, jenem barocken antikischen Bewegungsmanierismus, the Baroque antique mannerism of movement, and jener barocke Gebärdensprache, that Baroque gestural language ascribed to Pollaiuolo and later adopted by Leonardo and Michelangelo. So you can see two other examples that are familiar to you, I'm sure, and then there's Dürer's Death of Orpheus as being not sharing that Baroque gestural language. Warburg thus casts the northern artist as learning to spurn the superlatives favored by southern artists. Superlatives uncannily confirmed by the Laocoon statue unearthed in 1506 Rome. What Warburg describes as, quote, gestural languages, antique superlatives wandering from Athens through Rome, end quote, do not degenerate in Dürer's art. Furthermore, it is telling that the unearthing of antiquity's maximum engrammatic charge occurs, Warburg contends, after the Italian Baroque style had begun to flourish. Quote, the discovery of Laocoon was an outward symptom of an inwardly conditioned stylistic historical process. It marked the climax, not the birth, of Baroque degeneration. It was a revelation of something that the Italians had long sought and therefore found in the art of the ancient world, namely the extreme values of gestural and physiognomic expression, stylized in the sublime tragic form. While never clarifying why the Italians sought such extreme values, Warburg does insist their desire for tragedy and sublimity runs in cycles. As screens 37, 41, 41a, and 47 of the Mnemosyne Atlas attest, diverse Renaissance media such as relief sculpture, woodcut, drawing, fresco, oil painting, and manuscript illustration all give expression to these extreme values. Indeed, if Pollaiuolo, like Vasari and Giambattista Marino, is Baroque, so is Ghirlandaio, who is haunted too by recursive superlatives. As Warburg asserts in a 1914 lecture, quote, beneath the sign of a revived antiquity 100 years before Marino, Marinism already stirs in Ghirlandaio, end quote. Thus it was Dürer's historical task and Warburg's self-appointed critical task to find Wanderstraßen leading to a more measured encounter with classical antiquity and its Italian appropriation. Such invention was slow in coming for Warburg. His most sustained, complicated encounter with artists typically labeled Baroque is a lecture given at the KBW in 1926 titled Italian Classical Antiquity in Rembrandt's Time. Here, notwithstanding all the historical and cultural detail he offers in his portrait of the Dutch Baroque, which I am abbreviating drastically, it is Rembrandt's putative antipathy to Baroque style that became exemplary for Warburg and for his ad hoc psychological phenomenology of art history. While judgment about the Baroque style in the Rembrandt lecture are principally about the artificiel style, whose flamboyance in paintings, processions, and architecture serve chiefly to glorify rulers and astonish the rule, they concern too what any belated artist or spectator ought to do when tasked with mediating antiquity's charged memories. Thus, in Warburg's critical narrative, Antonio Tempesta, who dies in 1630, is cast, unfairly perhaps, as the unwitting master of Baroque superlatives. For Warburg, Tempesta's style is superficial, theatrical, and lacking in historical consciousness, though his dashing calligraphic manner is considered apt for, quote, Ovid's lively, adventurous prolixity, end quote. But if Warburg continues, quote, but if Warburg continues, Tempesta advocates the plaisir of the tied-off dynamogram, end quote. By contrast, Rembrandt, who avidly collected Tempesta's drawings, creates a vital Denkraum der Besonnenheit. Rembrandt's style and imitation of classical gestures are praiseworthy, not least because of the strength, quote unquote, of his artistic personality. So, in The Rape of Persephone, quote, sentimental phrases are blown away, end quote, as Rembrandt renews pathos formulae by stripping them of late Italian humanism's stylistic excesses. In depicting a violent mythic Catabasis, Rembrandt would confront and potentially master the demonic, but without yielding to Allegory's penchant for spectacle or allowing the ephemeral comforts of bathos. His painting disdains the pursuit of exorbitant affectus native to most Baroque dramatic, visual, and plastic arts. Instead, Warburg doggedly insists, Rembrandt remembers classical expressive values without the lens of mannerism distorting his view. Warburg also tackles the question of periodization. In a handwritten addition to the typescript of the lecture, he declares, every age has the renaissance of antiquity that it merits. If this strangely echoes Benjamin's claim about the Fortleben of a text in translation, Warburg's intent here is to reject both Winckelmann's serene classicism and the enthusiastic Baroque of his contemporaries in favor of a more contingent, dynamic Nachleben. His maxim agrees with Kant that aesthetic judgments are perforce subjective, but it anticipates more strongly still the likes of Gadamer, Blumenberg, and Benjamin, for whom interpretation is heavily informed by the hermeneutics historical and cultural horizons, as well as his psychological needs. In short, in the Rembrandt lecture, Warburg may be said to discover an interior, psychological, Rembrandtian Baroque, where pathos is palpably charged, but neither superlative to nor tied off from its earlier formulations. He discovers, in short, the Baroque he needs. Like Dürer, Rembrandt is held to redeem Baroque delight in spectacle and ostentatious ornamentation because he allows these elements to become part of his representation of human interiority, without letting them overwhelm either himself or the viewer. Given all this, how capacious and fluid a category is Warburg's Baroque. As a period concept, it stretches from late 15th century Rome to late 17th century Holland. But as a marker of a superlative style of thought, it is, as his writing about astrology confirms, thoroughly recursive. I will not rehearse how the conceptual tensions between Warburg's synchronic and diachronic Baroques fit within the endless debates about the nature of the Baroque style concept, except maybe to say that Warburg agrees with Nietzsche, Dawes, Deleuze, and others in wanting it both ways, in wanting to make it a historical and a universal creature. In this, it indeed resembles a pathos formel, whose claims on the eye and spirit are also historical and universal. And though he complicates matters in the Rembrandt lecture, the Baroque for Warburg is generally less an artistic or period style than a dubious ethical, psychological stance of the artist, poet, or critic towards antiquity's artistic legacy and the irrational elements it contains. The Baroque is Nachleben gone off its tracks. Like a comet, it follows an errant Wanderstrasse. Toward the end of his 1928 reading of Dürer's engraving, Benjamin obliquely glosses the comet streaking across its upper left-hand corner by citing lines from a play in which a marmot's red eyes, how do you say marmot in German? In any case, so a small rodent like a weasel, in which a marmot's red eyes, quote, gleam like a bloody comet, threatening destruction and horror. Stuffed with images of this ilk, German Baroque Trauerspiele, or mourning plays, need, Benjamin contends, to be saved from classical and Renaissance concepts of tragedy and decorum. While reading these plays as, quote, rooted in history, his Baroque book would also annul the verdicts of taste by grounding this genre and the period cultivating it in, quote, a philosophy of art that, fueled by allegory, seeks both mortification and salvation. Because of this duality, characters never shake off their immanence, even when they have eyes only for transcendence. And because of this duality, the rhetoric of the Trauerspiel is paratactic, aphoristic, hyperbolic, melancholic, and deeply allegorical. A theater of emblems or hieroglyphs, it strains to become, quote, sacred script. Interpreting Dürer's Melancholia I as a partial iconologist, and partial with both meanings here, partial iconologist, Benjamin is keen to find an avatar of the Baroque. As Sigrid Weigel, Matthew Rampli, Cornelia Zumbusch, and most recently Jane Newman have argued, Benjamin rehearses Warburg's interpretation in the prognostication essay of Dürer's engraving only to temper its faith in Proto-Enlightenment progress with his own, more pessimistic, melancholy vision of intellectual history. I want, though, to complicate somewhat this chiaroscuro critical narrative, mainly by focusing on their competing visions of Nachleben, and by considering how Warburg's invoked in the closing pages of the Trauerspiel book, which envision escape from Baroque melancholy toward ecstatic experience. Again, instead of reviving the past, Baroque allegory in Benjamin's hands mortifies it. Such allegories, therefore, not easily reconciled with Warburg's pathos formula. Benjamin is fascinated by form, whether it be genre or allegory, but these largely lack the liveliness, the balance, or Besonnenheit that Warburg craves. Often for Benjamin, melancholy verges dangerously on madness, exactly the kind of loss of control decried by Warburg, who feels compelled to find or invent historical periods where this danger is variously contained. For Benjamin, melancholy creates material, rhetorical, and conceptual excess that dialectically demands allegorical redemption. Thus, if the Trauerspiel book is riddled by the relations between word and image, its rebuses indicate exorbitant solutions. Like Warburg, Benjamin mines the history of astrology and mimics its analogic solutions, but he also remakes the Warburg-Saxel-Panofsky reading of melancholy in Dürer's engraving for his own, now skeptical, now mystical ends. Via mourning and melancholy, the Baroque artist and Benjamin, the belated critic, reach allegorical depths and crave epistemological heights. For the German Baroque stage does not reflect the cosmos. It is no theatrum mundi, but it functions rather as a, quote, space which belongs to an inner world of feeling. Asking how the Trauerspiel responds to the empty world, Benjamin answers that, quote, mourning is the state of mind in which feeling revives the empty world in the form of a mask and derives an enigmatic satisfaction in contemplating it, end quote. As public ostentation transforms private mourning, Hamlet, Sigismundo, and Leo Arminius tread the boards to embody at once Neoplatonic melancholy as a mark of genius and the sister notion that melancholy and madness are interchangeable fates. But even as he fleshes out these intellectual historical claims by turning to Melancholia I, Benjamin, as I see it, treats Dürer's loaded imagery as emblems foretelling his own reading of Baroque allegory. Rather than negotiating Warburg's theoretical agenda in the prognostication essay, namely that Luther was a liminal proto-enlightenment figure, or that, quote, and you all know this, quote, Athens wants always to be won back again from Alexandria, Benjamin looks forward to the second part of his book, quote, and this, the ripest and most mysterious fruit of the cosmological culture of Maximilian Circle, as Warburg has called it, may well be considered as a seed in which the allegorical flower of the Baroque, still held in check by the power of genius, lies ready to burst into bloom, end quote. Yet, the ingenious seed that is Dürer's engraving bears mutant, disappointing fruit in the Trauerspiel. For unlike Dürer, the German Baroque playwrights fail to express vividly, convincingly, their own subjectivity. premised on the idea that the Nachleben with which they wrestle is more medieval than it was classical or Senecan, Benjamin's verdict is also prompted by the larger demands made by his philosophy of art. Thus, part 1 ends with the figure, quote, of Hamlet, who uniquely in the, end quote, who uniquely in the Baroque period synthesizes Christianity and the classical legacy, and so is, quote, able to awaken within itself the clear light of self-awareness. In other words, melancholy, like allegory, ought to be dialectical. Melancholy, we are told, betrays the world for the sake of knowledge. But if this betrayal, which is Benjamin's betrayal as well, undermines the Warburg Circle's reading of Dürer's engraving, it is not because Warburg failed to prize self-awareness as well. As Professor Zumbusch reminds us, Warburg treats the pathos formel in Dürer's hands as a form of interiorization and energetic inversion that also, I would add, spurns Baroque solipsism in excess. A related question, then, is how Benjamin's critique of the Romantic symbol and championing of Baroque allegory is mirrored in Warburg's treatment of symbol and metaphor. Rejecting the Romantic symbol's efforts to forge, quote, the unity of the material and the transcendental object, Benjamin turns to allegory in the book's second half, where he roots his own critical approach in 17th century aesthetics. Quote, the Baroque apotheosis is a dialectical one. It is accomplished in the movement between extremes, end quote. That's like Warburg's notion of polarity, or that cognitive oscillation between Magie and Logik, between too much proximity to phenomena and too much distance from them. Benjaminian allegory seeks mediation. Yet when Benjamin glosses the antinomies of allegorical interpretation, his paralogic, or Schlitterlogik, neglects pragmatic historical contingent meanings in ways that Warburg surely would have blamed. In the Trauerspiele, Benjamin famously contends, quote, any person, any object, any relationship can mean absolutely anything else. With this possibility, a destructive but just verdict is passed on the profane world. It is characterized as a world in which the detail is of no great importance, in der es aufs Detail so streng nicht ankommt. And though Benjamin's 1933 essay, Strenger Kunstwissenschaft, will urge attention to the, quote, insignificant or inconspicuous aspect, here detail is sacrificed to allegory's dialectical powers. Quote, the profane world is both elevated and devalued by allegory. In its written form as script, that would be a vehicle, the sacred Baroque allegory tends towards hieroglyphics, toward the image. Yet if Benjamin's language often weirdly echoes Warburg's, there's even a moment there where he uses the word Ausprägung, their common rejection of the Romantic symbol leads in antithetical directions. For Benjamin, such hieroglyphs are natural historical runes fit for melancholic allegoresis, whereas for Warburg, finding polarity and memory in the symbol identifies it as a still dynamic pathos formula, whereby the spectator can revel in his own metaphoric distance in his own metaphorical distance from the kind of decline or verfall that troubles Benjamin. For Warburg, too much abstraction foils this contemplation, too little, and the great emotion that precipitated the symbol myth in the first place threatens to overwhelm the artist critic. Moving then, without comment from script to sculpture, Benjamin invokes the Belvedere torso to help him distinguish between Romantic and Baroque interpretations of classical antiquity. Both interpretations are hostile to classicism, but whereas Romanticism urges an aesthetic take, the Baroque, contemplating dry rebuses, treats art as a problem and so turns to theology for assistance. It is at this point, moving by analogy back from visual art to literature, that Benjamin offers his much dissected neo-Baroque analogy. Quote, allegories are in the realm of thoughts, what runes are in the realm of things. Thus, while Warburg insists on placing runes safely in grisaille, Benjamin foregrounds them to better serve allegoresis. For him, the richness of the Baroque and allegory is, quote, multiplicity of meaning, end quote, and no object is richer in interpretations or more ambiguous than the fragmented rune. As for the question of taste, if Warburg and Benjamin both react against Wölflin's formalist approach to the Baroque and art history more generally, Wölflin did help them obviate aesthetic judgments. Warburg's distaste for Baroque Entartung is palpable enough, but this seems motivated less by aesthetic preference and more by intellectual spiritual need. As Didi Ubermann urges, Warburg's Kulturwissenschaft is deeply symptomatic. For different reasons, Benjamin also scorns aesthetic judgments. To avoid leap over summary dismissals of the Schauspieler as just so much bombast, he insists on analyzing form. And despite his obvious taste for their esoteric aspects, he consistently casts his judgments about these plays as epistemological ones. Because he's captivated by their form, idea, or metaphysical substance, and because he's immune to their affectus, the Schauspieler can literally and figuratively be ideal. Hence, for all the rich historicity he discovers in the Baroque, Benjamin ultimately adopts a more synchronic than diachronic perspective. Not only is the Baroque book presented as an account of his own schooling, Schulung, but it's grounded in the perception that post-World War I Germany, like the Germany during the 30 Years' War, is a time of Verfall. While Warburg looked iconologically to Quattrocento Italy for renewal, Benjamin looks allegorically to the Baroque not for renewal, but for the means to make sense of what he idiosyncratically understands as natural history. In a reductive word, if Warburg seeks Nachleben, Benjamin desires mortification. Criticism, Benjamin asserts, means the mortification of the works. So as the book heads towards its enigmatic conclusion, its ponderación misteriosa, Benjamin seizes upon the corpse as the ultimate emptying out of physis, nature. If allegory gives form to the conflict between Christianity and paganism, for Benjamin, the memento mori, the death's head, points, quote, not just to the abyss of evil, end quote, and the insoluble problem of representing infinity, but also to, quote, the limit set upon allegorical contemplation. It is here, when trying to solve this final riddle, whereas Lowenstein's verse has it, the skull suddenly appears to be an angel's countenance, that Benjamin cites thrice Warburg's prognostication essay. The first instance occurs in a discussion of Renaissance occultism. Quote, prompted by elective affinity, als wahlverwandter Stimmung, Warburg fascinatingly unfolds how in the Renaissance celestial appearances were comprehended in human terms in order to at least pictorially limit their demonic potency, end quote. This is taken from the Schlusswort, just before Warburg more famously declares, Wir sind im Zeitalter des Faust. Now, whether the elective affinity that Benjamin feels with Warburg extends to the latter's recursive view of history remains unclear. Just after citing Warburg, though, he claims that, quote, the Renaissance awakens a visual speculation whose emblematics are bound up with the world of the Middle Ages, end quote. In other words, Baroque emblematics, as discussed throughout the Schauspiel book, is the product of a briefer Nachleben than Warburg was willing to admit. Yet alternately, the elective affinity Warburg enjoys with his materials is surely paralleled by how Benjamin's own methods sympathize with the Baroque ones he studies. With the second citation, Warburg is enlisted, along with Usna, to buttress the theory of Baroque allegory. In the section titled Mourning and the Origin of Allegory, Usna is quoted at length to explain how the gods became abstractions in the course of antiquity, a process culminating in the Alexandrian school. Again, I mean, the last paper, Professor Wolf's paper, made me think, again, Warburg is infected in a sense with the second-hand kind of Viconianism. And you see that here. Well, I guess Benjamin, by osmosis, is also contaminated with the same virus, if you will. But such a process was made more profound, Benjamin claims, when notions of Christian guilt, which already taint worldly objects with the fall, were incorporated. Then Warburg is cited, and I put the citation here because it's complex. Then it is at this point that Warburg is cited. Quote, "The formal beauty of the figures of the gods and the tasteful reconciliation of Christian and pagan beliefs should not blind us to the fact that even in Italy around 1520, that is, at the time of the most free and creative artistic activity, antiquity was venerated, as it were, in a double herma, which had one dark demonic countenance that called for a superstitious cult, and another serene Olympian one, which demanded aesthetic veneration. To this, however," Benjamin adds, "the three most important impulses in the origin of Western allegory are non-antique, anti-antique. The gods project into the alien world. They become evil and they become creatures. The attire, Kleid, of the Olympians is left behind, and in the course of time, the emblems collect around it. And this attire is as creaturely as a devil's body." Here Warburg is slyly, effectively used to deny the afterlife of antiquity in favor of the afterlife of medieval superstition. Further, in light of Benjamin's account of creaturely Kleid, of creaturely attire, one cannot but recall Warburg's characteristic reading of fluttering garments as instances of bewegtes Leben. In this respect, Warburg plays the pagan, whereas Benjamin rehearses Christian theology. Where Warburg sees a pathos formel and his beloved salvational nymph, Benjamin sees, quote, "the deadness of the figures and the abstraction of the concepts, which are themselves the precondition of the allegorical metamorphosis of the pantheon into the world of magical conceptual creatures," end quote. In sum, Benjamin looks to and beyond mementi mori, whereas Warburg presents details of bewegtes Leben as charting a middle way between a demonic countenance and an Olympian one. As for the third citation, Benjamin intriguingly invokes it to move closer to Warburg's position. Warburg is quoted as insisting that any account of Renaissance astrology tacitly accepted by the Christian Church must not forget its atavistic pagan elements. Benjamin agrees, and with this he turns back to the Trauerspiel. Given this agreement, in the final section of my paper, I had wanted to discuss Warburg's self-nominated Bruno-Reise, that is, his sojourn in Italy with Gertrude Bing from September 1928 to June 1929, during which they wrestled with the words and images of the Baroque cosmographer Giordano Bruno. I had wanted to show how Bruno's heroic allegorization of pagan myth and Copernican astronomy moved Warburg to adumbrate not only a form of diagrammatic thought and intellectual history that was hailed by his friend Ernst Cassirer, but also how in his letters, Tagebuch entries, and Bruno notebook, Warburg baroquely allegorizes his own Kulturwissenschaft as a form of heliotropism and ascent. And those are Warburg's words. I had wanted to suggest how all this brings him closer to Benjamin's Baroque. But since I've almost already used my time, let me conclude by asserting that with Bruno, and I would add Kepler, figures who exemplarily balance polar forces, Warburg implicitly separates the vices of Baroque art from the virtues of Baroque science. This is puzzling, I think, because Warburg's interpretation of Alexandrian astrology is never divorced from his interpretation of art history. It also raises the question of whether Warburg's comparative Kulturwissenschaft loses coherence somewhat when it comes to the Baroque. Perhaps it does, though I suspect that had he lived longer, Warburg might have reconciled these two strands of the Baroque, just as he subtly, mosaic-like, as Zaxel puts it, integrates art historical and astrological images in the Atlas. But as for the Wahlverwandtschaft between Warburg's and Benjamin's version of the Baroque, it is largely, I think, a tropological one. Both men mine Baroque excess to help write versions of intellectual history structured by rhetorical figures. For Warburg, when symbols, metaphors become tied off, the Baroque emerges. For Benjamin, when allegory becomes dynamic, bombastic, riddled by extremes, the Baroque reigns. Warburg's pathos formulae are riddled by polarities that stop short of being dialectical in the ways that Benjamin wants allegory to be. Though Warburg's notion of inversion, or what happens when pathos formulae are taken up by Christianity, does sometimes approximate Benjaminian allegory. Benjamin would save Baroque allegory from being eclipsed by the Romantic symbol, while Warburg, who also denies the symbol's immanence, would untie metaphor from astrological hieroglyphs and so temper its superlative claims. Eyeing the recurrent specter of hieroglyphic thought, Warburg, in the introduction to Mnemosyne, signals why, quote, the new pathos-laden gestural language of pagan origin, end quote, was learned with such difficulty in the late Quattrocento. I quote again, with the practitioners of Hellenistic astrology, the clear naturalness of the Greek pantheon became a conglomeration of monstrous shapes. Given their opacity as grotesque hieroglyphs of fate for human credulity, they perforce provoked the emphatic demand of an epoch which called for organic clarity in external stylistic appearance, end quote. But Warburg too feels compelled to clarify such hieroglyphs of fate. He too would dispel this specter, one, thanks to Athanasius Kircher and others, long prospered in Baroque Rome. By contrast, as I've argued, Benjamin avidly reads Baroque writing as hieroglyphic to serve his allegorical ends. Thus, in the end, while their motives differ, both men cultivate anachronic Baroques. If anachronism or anachronism, as Christopher Wood and Alexander Nagel have it, charges artistic memory with inventing meaning outside the strictures of chronology, then Warburg's Nachleben and Benjamin's Mortification both thrive in this mode. Their Baroques speak to the needs of the present and the future as much as they make claims on the past. Or, as Petrarch put it long ago, as he wavered between his love for antiquity and desire for eternity, it is better to will the good than to know the truth. Thank you.